So you finished your novel. You have a complete first draft. And now you have to revise that baby. In this video, I'm going to show you the very first thing that you need to do when revising any novel. It does not matter what type of novel you wrote. This is always going to be the first step, and that is the initial read through. We're getting right into it, folks. This is a vital step, so don't skip it. During the initial read through, you read your story for the first time the way a reader would. You just read it straight through. You aren't changing things, but you are leaving comments for yourself in the margin. This step is literally just reading and taking notes. Don't let yourself pitter around inside the story. That comes later. So first, in this video, I'm going to share with you some examples of what you might write in the margins during your initial read through, and then I'm going to bring you along with me while I read through my own current work in progress. It will be my first read through since completing the first draft. So I'm going to do an initial read through on camera with you for you to watch and hopefully learn something. Remember, I'm not going to be fixing anything, just seeing what's here in the story. That's all we're doing. We're just reading. The goal of this step is to become familiar enough with the story that you can then let it simmer and percolate in your mind while you take a little break until you decide that it's time to actually come back and begin draft 2. Okay? Okay, so let's get into it. First, here are 11 examples of things you might take notes on. The first one is for your sanity, and that is when you find mistakes at the line level or prose that you are dissatisfied with, write a comment in the margin that says, "Make better writing," and then move on. No tinkering. Example note number 2. The characters feel flat. It could be that while you were writing your first draft, you didn't have a full grasp of your character's thoughts or motivations, so you wrote them a little bit flat. And that's fine. You just need to leave yourself a little comment whenever you're in a scene and the character feels flat, so that you can come back and fix it later. Number 3. On a similar note, mark down moments where the character's motivations are unclear or non-existent. It could be that during the first draft, you knew what the characters needed to be doing, so you just made them do it, even though their motivations weren't yet clear to you. Or maybe you thought you were conveying their motivations, but on this read-through, you realized that you weren't. So now you leave yourself a little note in the margins that says, "Establish character desires earlier in the story," or something along those lines. Number 4. Scene transitions. You might make note of places where you need to write a better transition between two scenes, or if you are like me and tend not to include any connective tissue during your first draft, you might make note of places that currently have no transition between scenes, and you're gonna need to add those later. So number 5 is lines of prose that aren't working. So this is not number 1, where you just feel like the prose is off and you gotta fix it. This is where you come across a line that's just not right anymore for the story. Either things have changed or your writing changed, and you know that you're gonna end up deleting those lines. Or maybe you feel like you hate that line and so you want to rewrite it right now. Don't do any of that. All you're gonna do is take the line, copy and paste, put it in a comment, and then deal with it later. So you just remove the line, put it in a comment, so that instead of deleting them, you're just writing to yourself that you need to deal with this later. It could be lines that don't work for the story anymore, but you really like the prose, so you don't want to delete them, so you don't need to delete them. We're not changing the prose right now. We're not changing anything. Just gonna take that line, pop it on over into the margins. Move on. Number 6, pacing. This might be the biggest one that you take notes on while you're doing your read-through, unless you were following a very strict outline while writing your first draft. Because this will be the first time that you are reading the story like a reader, and you experience the scenes as they are rather than how you imagine them to be. You might mark moments where the pacing is too fast and the story needs to linger a little longer in order to allow for breathing room between scenes. Or on the other hand, you might mark moments that feel too meandering and are too slow and need to be condensed and focused. Just make note of that in the margin. If while you're reading the pacing feels off, it could be because you are either missing important scenes that you didn't realize you would need when you were writing the first draft, or you've written multiple scenes that repeat the same beat in the story, or serve the same purpose. So then the pacing feels overly slow and labored. Just mark that in the margins and move on. Next, inconsistencies between what you intended to write and what is actually on the page. Maybe you know what a character is thinking, but it isn't conveyed appropriately yet. So you just write out their motivation in a comment in the margins so you can work with it later. Number 8. Inconsistencies in description or character. For example, if you know your character is bald or has a buzz cut, but then randomly in the middle of the story, their hair starts blowing in the wind. You want to make note of that in the margins. Number 9. Unintended meaning in scenes. This one is a little bit tricky to spot, but for example, while you're reading through your draft as a reader rather than a writer, you might spot places where a reader could infer some meaning from the scenes that you did not intend to be there, or that you didn't realize you had written into the scene when you first wrote it. So maybe during a tense conversation, you might have been intending to write a witty comeback for one of the characters, but then when you read that scene, you realize a reader could actually infer from what you've written that the character is not just saying a witty comeback, but actually has some kind of information that they're holding over the other person in the scene. You know, you just wrote this argument so that one specific character could come out on top, and you didn't realize you made it seem like there was other stuff going on beneath the surface. But the reality is that, you know, in the story, there is no information that are holding over the other character, and, you know, whatever undercurrents are happening in the scene never come back to play again in the story because you didn't mean for them to be there. You know, that's what reading like a reader is. You're trying to see what a reader could get from the story, not looking at it the way that you were looking at it while you were writing. You know, a reader can infer things and see things and put together things that you did not mean for them to see or put together. And you just want to kind of be aware of that while you're reading, you know? What might be inferred from this scene that could completely throw them off of what the story I'm actually trying to tell is. Kind of hard to spot, but once you get used to it, you know, you might start realizing it's kind of evident in a lot of your first draft scenes. Number 10. Filler names. Make note of any places or people that got filler names so you can come back and give them real names later. For example, if your characters spend a lot of time at an inn and you always just call it the inn, then mark that in the margins because you're going to want to come back to it and add a real name later. Number 11. Missing scenes or information. Make note of important scenes or bits of information you know the story needs, but it currently doesn't have. For example, mark scenes that need to include foreshadowing or added layers of tension, but don't currently have those elements come through easily for the reader. You know, once you're reading your story, it will be easy for you to spot places where you know foreshadowing needs to be because you know what happens later, you know? But right now the foreshadowing is missing. So instead of trying to come up with that now, you just write a little note, and, you know, include foreshadowing in this scene. And then move on. Okay, so those were just some examples of notes. Obviously, you can write whatever notes your story needs in your margins. But this step is literally just reading like a reader and taking notes. That's it, that's the whole step. So before I bring you along with me to begin the initial read-through of my first draft, I just want to say like a little caveat here. In order to get the best bang for your buck, most people will tell you to wait a while before doing this step so that you can come back to the first draft with fresh eyes. And that's fair, you know, maybe that works for a lot of people. But for me, when I'm writing the first draft, I forget things as soon as I write them. So my eyes are always fresh. Plus, the purpose of this read-through for me is to actually prepare for my break from the manuscript, where I allow time for the story to simmer and percolate in my mind. You know, so I can mull over the events of the story before ever actually doing anything on the page. And I cannot mull or simmer or percolate when I literally don't remember anything that happened in the story. So taking a break before this initial read-through would be just kind of useless because my brain would be empty. So I need these initial thoughts in my head in order for the simmering to begin and for it to be productive. But that's just me, you know? Maybe you do need to take a break before doing your initial read-through. And that's fine. Do whatever works for you. But I would still recommend taking at least a little break after doing this read-through so you can have some of that, you know, nice, juicy simmering time. But again, that's just me. Alright, so my draft is 139 single-space pages in Microsoft Word. And while I was writing the first draft, I actually did leave myself comments in the margins. Because that's just how I write, you know, while I'm writing. So before starting my initial read-through, there are currently 89 comments in the margins of this draft. A lot of those were just me working through the story, and they don't really pertain anymore. So for the most part, I'm just going to delete those, or I'll leave them if they do still pertain. The important thing is, I'm not trying to fix anything now. So if I come to the comments that are already there, and I don't need them anymore, I'm going to delete them, or I'm going to leave them, but I'm not going to change anything in the story. That's all I'm saying. You know, when I'm writing the first draft and I can tell a scene isn't going the way I want it to be going, I would just make a little note of it in the margins for my future self. To be like, hey, pay attention, this scene's bad. You know, I do that so I won't lose momentum during my first drafts. So there are 89 comments, but yeah, that's just what it is. You might be starting from scratch on the note front, but again, you just do you. Okay, so it's now the next day. I ended up working on this for about an hour and a half last night, and then I've actually worked on it for like 2.5 hours today. And I'm currently on page 96 or 93 of 139 pages. I feel like I'm not reading slow, but it's going slower than I was expecting. For some reason, I thought I could read this in all in one day, which no, it doesn't really make sense because it's a whole book. You know, I don't really typically read whole books in one day, but it's not going too bad. I mean, I don't think I'll be able to finish it today. I don't even know if I'll be able to finish it tomorrow, so we'll just see about that. So it had 89 comments when I started this from my first draft. We are now at 117 comments, so I've definitely been adding more than I've been deleting. I actually only deleted like one, and then I stopped reading the comments because I was just like not paying attention to them because I was reading the story. So I'm hoping there will still be some comments that aren't relevant to the story that I'll just end up deleting in the future, but I don't know. For now, we're at 117 comments. Mostly they've been about pacing. At the beginning of the story, especially, the pacing is way too fast. Like there's not enough lingering breathing room between events, and I assume that's because two reasons. One, I don't normally write the connective tissue during my first drafts, but I did during this one for like the first time ever, and so it's all just like really short and needs to be elaborated on. And also, I think possibly like it will need like a whole subplot woven in at the beginning because the pacing is currently so fast, which would make sense because I have a hard time adding subplots to my stories because I always feel like they slow them down, and so I usually end up adding not enough subplots. So I've made note of all of that. There were two instances where I felt like the character was acting way out of character, so I made a note of that. And then I found one scene that when I first made note of it, I felt like the whole scene might be unnecessary, but since I've gotten further in the story, I think maybe the scene just needs to be changed somehow. I'm not sure. So I've made note of all of these things. I've taken it from 89 comments to 117. That's where we are. We're going through. We're about 50 pages away from the end. It's a slow process. For some reason, I wasn't expecting it to be this. Okay, it's the same day. I have no idea how many hours I spent on this today, but it's almost 11 p.m. and I just finished my read. So I read the whole thing. There are 129 comments now in total, which isn't bad. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not too bad. The main thing was pacing. The pacing in the beginning was way too fast. The pacing in the middle was the best of all of the pacing, and then the pacing at the end felt like stuttering. Like it felt like several of the scenes were just being repeated information, you know, like the characters kept doing the same things. So that's good to know. It's something I need to work on. But I've obviously marked it all. There was also like a couple of inconsistencies that I found, and there was one character whose name kept changing throughout the draft to the point where I'm not even sure if I was originally intending him to be one or two people. So all very interesting things, you know. But yeah, that's my initial read through, and now I'm just gonna let it percolate in my mind for a while and let it simmer. Okay, I know it might not be evident, but I have been trying to talk slower during these videos. I am aware that I talk too fast, but when I watch YouTube videos, I always either watch them at 1.5, 1.75, or 2 times the speed, you know, depending on whether or not I'm actually watching the video or listening to it while I do something else. I never watch it on just one regular speed, you know, like the speed that it was uploaded to YouTube. It's always way too slow for me. Why do people talk so slow? But I am trying. I do get a lot of comments from people saying, you know, they don't want to watch my videos on half speed, and could I please talk slower? And I have been for the last couple of videos going into them with the thought, okay, Elizabeth, we're going to be talking slower. And then, you know, it goes right out the window and I start talking at top speed. But it's a work in progress. I'm just... Also, I do offer fiction editing on Fiverr, anything from short stories or single chapters to whole novels. If anybody has a story out there that they'd like for me to look at, please check out the link in the description box below. Thank you!